Welcome, and again, why don't I go ahead and get started, and we're going to go back to our traditional format again. So Monica and I are going to have the conversation, mostly Monica, which is good for everybody, about survey design and things that will help you be a better survey researcher. As of today, marketing people have told me you're supposed to title things that way, like, become a better survey researcher in 3 easy steps. So that you have something to walk away from today with. And after we get through this content, let's do the Q&A and go into small groups if there's time and when there's time. So if you have questions, start putting them up now. Also, the things that are on top of your mind or things you want to say. So let me get started. I'm going to just talk about the first 2 that are on this slide: the identifying the purpose, the survey's purpose, and knowing your audience. And just to be very, very clear about what our expectations are for today is we want to give you some very practical, pragmatic pieces. But because the choices you make within a survey will depend on what your survey, like who you're surveying, but also the topic, some of this will be a little general. But these are actually things that we think about, and we actually had a call on this last week, and as we kicked it around, and the whole team, but Monica and I in particular, what are things that we do when we build a survey? That's kind of the spirit of what we're doing. So I'm going to talk to you first. Let me talk to you a little bit about the purpose of the survey and where do you want, as you're building out a survey, what are you trying to accomplish, right? So there are a couple things that immediately come to mind when I think of purpose, right? Do I need this for research? Do I need it to complete an evaluation? So that's kind of a form of research. Am I looking for, kind of marketing, demographics? What am I doing? What is my purpose for this survey? Am I trying to know how well what type of participation I have in my programming? And so as you think about the purpose of your survey, that should help inform how you build it out. Right. So rarely do we do something where demographics are the most important thing we want in our survey, or the most important part of our survey. And candidly, sometimes, we don't, I wouldn't say we always care about the demographic questions, but they may not even be germane to our analysis. Right. So it doesn't hurt us if we don't have them. Well, I'm going to put questions like that at the end. Right. The fact of the matter is, the most important questions that I need answered, I want at the top of my survey, because I don't know, especially if it's one where I'm not sitting in front of somebody and they're completing it, where if they're completing it online, which we do a lot of times now, I want to get the questions that I need answered out there first, because I've done surveys now for about 20 years. And I will say 25 to 30% of surveys that I've collected have been partially completed, because I'm sure you all have done some of those, right? You start out taking a survey, something else gets in the way, you never quite get back to it. We understand, we do the same thing. Well, then I need to get the most important questions from my perspective, from my purpose, up in front of you as quickly as possible. So what is my purpose? And then the other part I would argue on purpose is, and this bleeds into audience, right? So the purpose and the audience kind of tie together, is I want to make sure that my survey isn't clouding or leading you with the questions that are in it, right? So if my purpose is to understand what you know about the Midwest Center, I don't want to give you our mission statement when I'm writing it, right? So really being very deliberative before you write your questions about what do I really want to know from people? What do I really want to understand from them and about them? It becomes critically important. I mean, we're in election season right now. There's pollsters on both sides. There's a great website for those of you who are political junkies called 538. I highly recommend it if you like political polling and stuff like that. Check it out. And they actually rate the pollsters, and you can actually read the actual questions that pollsters ask. It's worth a try. It's worth if you're really bored, I guess. I find it interesting. Go and read the different pollsters. There's Republican pollsters, there's Democratic pollsters, and then there's scientific, more down the middle. And go read, take a Democrat, take a Republican, take one down the middle, and you'll see how when they want to boost their candidate spirits, the questions are leading. And it's just an interesting thing to see. So let me talk to you real briefly about audience, and I'm going to hand it over to my amiga, Monica. My slide's not changing here. Perfect. Audience, purpose is obviously critically important. Audience is so important also. And what I'm asking you to think about here is, who is your, what age group, what reading level, what ethnicity. We are in a changing time in so many different ways, and I will tell you that one of the things that when I started doing surveys 20-some years ago versus where we are today, sexual or how someone identifies from a gender perspective has changed, and you need to ask the question the right way so you get the correct answer, right? So if you just ask male or female today, that's not a good question. And so as you build your questions out, you really need to think about who your audience is. Age is a huge piece, right? We've done surveys for kids, and we've done surveys, right, for academics. Audience is a critical piece, because how complicated can your questions be? They should always be as simple as possible, no matter what age the audience is. But when we work with kids who have low literacy because they're in second or third grade or first grade or kindergarten, you can't even necessarily use words, right? You use pictures, right? It's like you go to the doctor and they have the pain scale. That's a really good question, the way that's written, the pain scale, because it uses, faces to identify where you are on the scale. Really important things to think about. I've always been a believer you should try, and if you're just writing to a general audience, you should write it about a 6th grade level on surveys. Generally a pretty good middle point. The other thing I'd say about audiences, and James asked a really good question before we even started about internal and external stakeholders. One piece on that, James, I'm going to bring up right now, which is the use of jargon. If I'm working with a general audience, I need to make sure I do not use jargon. Right now, in order to make sure I don't use jargon, oh no, I'm glad it's just a drill, Colette. And in order to make sure I don't use jargon, I need someone else to read it. And when I talk about jargon, right, we're just talking about words that are inside baseball, right, that are particular to a specific group or profession. Now, if I'm working with internal stakeholders, I don't have to be as concerned with that, because we're all using the same lexicon and vocabulary. And so as I construct questions, again, for external stakeholders, for general community, I want to make sure that I'm paying attention to who the audience is from both a writing level and a reading level, but also from a jargon perspective. So audience is really important, and it'll inform the types of questions I can and can't ask. I'm going to kick it over to Monica, I think.
Okay. So like we've talked about in previous sessions, and Scott's mentioned some of this just now, when you're doing research for your organization, so whether it's interviews, surveys, observations, whatever it is that you're collecting, you need to think about the perspective of those you're interacting with, as Scott mentioned, and what your purpose is, and the best to learn more through, in this case, your survey. So we'll talk about some different things. There's a lot that you can do, and there's a lot to think about. So we'll kind of buzz through some of the main things to think about, and then we can go into more depth if people have questions or at a later time too. But we'll kind of cover an overview of things. So when we're talking about validity and reliability, so these are things you hear a lot about in research. So these are two main things that when people are doing research, they really want to think about, and that you really want to think about in your survey design as well. So you want to be sure that you're actually measuring or inquiring about what you really aim to measure or find out about. So you don't want to ask questions in a survey that don't really get you what you're trying to find out. Not only is that going to be poor representation ultimately of what you're seeking to understand, but it wastes people's time. So you just want to be really clear about what you're trying to get out of it. So again, going back to what is your purpose, really be clear on that going into it. And then you also want to be sure that your survey or anything you're doing around your research, like I said, whether it be the interview stage, anything that you're doing to gather information, that you're being consistent in your practices. So that goes for surveys too. So what that means is, like as an example in a survey, that may be when you send out multiple surveys over time, you want to measure things over time, or to various audiences, which we kind of touched on a little bit. You're asking a question relating to, like the example of gender identity or age, so you're asking the question in the same way every time. So if you're going to send out a survey like every few months to different groups of people, and then you're going to use that data collectively, you want questions around like your demographic data for sure, and possibly likely other things as well, to be consistent so that you can use all of that information together. So you want to be sure that your survey is also reliable. And so that could be, you know, if you want to send it out to additional audiences, that sort of thing, you just want it to be as consistent as possible in your practices. So this doesn't mean that you won't change or adapt your survey over time. Likely you will need to. If you're using anything that's over a span of time, it's going to change, as Scott indicated, to be more representative of the information you're seeking to find out about your organization as your organization changes, or the work within your organization. Also to represent the changing community that you serve, perhaps. So you just really want to be thoughtful, though, about the changes that you do make. Okay. So I have a lot to talk about in terms of making choices. So bear with me, but I just want to go over some things that I think will be helpful tools and things to think about. When we talk about making choices in surveys, obviously there are a lot of choices, mostly around word choice is what we think about, but there are other choices too. So the biggest areas to really think about are our choices in, like I said, the phrasing or the wording of our questions, also in who receives the survey, again, who the audience is. Also things like when the survey is given. So timing, and then how it's given, in what platform. So what might be most convenient for you in terms of creating a survey and sending it out may not be the best way for your audience or your recipients to receive it. So surveys now, there's tons of different platforms that you can use to put them out there, but really thinking about how is this going to end up with the people that I really need it to end up with, so that I can get the best information possible. So if that's not by email, and instead that's a survey done in person, that's something to think about, even though that may not be like the most convenient way to do it necessarily. So again, wording is huge when you are thinking about your intention and your purpose of your survey. Scott mentioned this also, but you don't want to lead people. So be sure to word questions in a way where you're not leading people to a particular answer. So for example, you wouldn't want to start a question with, do you agree that, and then fill in the blank. You're already telling them basically that they should agree with what you're about ready to tell them. And of course you may think that they should agree with you, but that's not going to get you great information. You want people to really form their own authentic opinions and answers. Otherwise, information is just not going to be very useful to you. So word choice also has bias. So just like everything that goes through our brains as we're processing anything, there's going to be biases. And so being really aware of your bias. Are you choosing words? Are you choosing a way in saying something that creates bias? And that may get you different information than you hope to. It may also resonate differently with the people who are receiving it. Also, social desirability is something that is big in surveys. So that just basically means that if you're asking a question around something that has like a social expectation around it, how you're asking that question could lead people to want to not be completely truthful in their answering. So, for example, if you're asking about somebody's, again, it's an election season, about their voting habits, some people who either choose not to vote or maybe they didn't vote, if you're asking them about voting behavior, you can phrase things in a way that's like, you know, did something prevent you from being able to vote, as opposed to just did you not vote or something like that. So you want to think about how you phrase the question so that you're not basically calling them out in the question doing something that you think they should do, or at least make it sound like that. That may not be your intention. So that one's a little trickier, but just really thinking about bias and how you're phrasing things so you're not setting someone up to be on the defensive when answering a question. So just a few more things to think about when you're making choices. So again, you want to determine the best format. Like I said, the most convenient format for you to get your survey out may or may not be the best way for it to be delivered. So you can determine which option best suits the type of question also. So when you think about the types of questions that you want to ask, what are those going to look like in the form that you're using? And then format your questions accordingly, both to the platform and to the content. So this kind of goes into, okay, now I know kind of where I'm going to present my survey. Now what is that going to actually look like and sound like, depending on how it's being delivered? So you want to think about the different types of questions. You've thought about your wording. So now how are they going to be able to be answered? Are they going to be answered in like a closed list of options, a closed question, or are they going to be an open question where you are going to allow people to either explain or write in what their answers are? So there's lots of ways to go about that. And there's kind of some general rules around things. So if you're giving a closed question and you have a list of options for people to choose from, you don't want to have like 20 things to choose from, ideally. If you can stick to like 4, 5, 6 max options, that's ideal. You can also randomize those in some platforms where they're coming up in different orders for different survey recipients. So that helps to get away from people choosing just like the first one or the last one that they read, which often happens. Or if you've put them in there kind of categorically, it helps to kind of get rid of that categorization so that people are really thinking more about what they're answering, and you get a little bit more random data. Another good thing to do is to pilot study or test a survey. This should be done every time you do a survey, at least like somebody else, in a colleague or a friend, somebody, have them look at it with another set of eyes so that they can see any weird wording, any mistakes, anything that sounded good in your head when you were putting it together, but maybe doesn't make sense on paper. That's an important thing to do also. If you do have like a scale question, that would be one area to not randomize. Don't make it like overly confusing. If it's going to be like great, good, not so good, poor, like make sure it stays in that order. You don't want to randomize all your questions. So depending on what survey platform you're using, that's something to think about. You can't just choose like randomize everything. You have to be really intentional about each question. Another good thing to keep in mind is to only ask one question at a time. It sounds obvious, but you'll see if you do look at surveys, or like Scott's recommendation 538 is fantastic if you want to be a survey nerd like me. And you can go look at it, and you'll see that sometimes like multiple questions are asked in one question. And then you're given like only answers that can answer one of the questions. And so it becomes confusing and frustrating to the people who are answering it. And ultimately, that's just not going to give you a good answer. So you really want to be logical in all of these things, and just thinking about putting yourself in the person who's doing the survey, put yourself in their shoes. And just remember that even the slightest word or format choice may impact how they're answering. So you want to just be really clear. And again, thinking about who that audience member is who's taking it. So I talked a little bit about, just briefly, about testing out your survey. So this is a really good thing to do. So you could do like a little pre-test group, test it out and see how things come back, how things are answered, because unfortunately, like the things that you'll learn the most come after the survey's been done. So it's great for the next survey that you're putting together, but you don't want to like learn a whole bunch of stuff that you would have done differently after you've sent it out to a lot of people. So it's great if you can test it out and send it out to some people beforehand, get some feedback, and also just for yourself, some things might surface as you're looking at the way people answered questions, or maybe questions that they left blank, if that was an option, and ask yourself, maybe that was not straightforward or clear enough, or maybe I'm not asking this in the right way. But just because things surprise you doesn't mean that that's necessarily bad. I mean, you definitely want to find out as much as you can that you don't already know. If you already knew all of the answers, there would be no reason to survey. So it's just finding that balance of, is this logical, but did we learn something? Okay, and so then we can talk a little bit more about this if people have questions specifically. We can talk about it more in the discussion too. There's lots of things to talk about in terms of how you analyze closed and open-ended questions. So if you have survey questions that have just a scale or options, or if they're even just yes/no answers, those are pretty straightforward. How you interpret them, though, may not be as straightforward. So you may end up with data that is very easy to analyze in terms of putting it in a spreadsheet and putting it in a bar chart, but then thinking about what story is this telling us, and what does this really mean? Like, what do these numbers really mean? And putting a narrative to it, that's the part that's going to take a little bit more intention and thought. And then open-ended questions is definitely something to think about in terms of, if you've offered a survey with a question where you just had an open space for people to fill out what they had to say, that's a great thing to do, because you will often get answers that if you had given a predetermined list, people will just select from that. They may select something they would have thought of, but if you have that open box, they can really speak to their personal experience, and you may learn about options or things that you wouldn't have even thought to put in your list. So those can be really helpful if, again, wording and the phrasing of the question is helpful. But when you analyze that open-ended question responses, it's similar to what we talked about in a previous session about interview data, is that you want to look for themes, you want to look for key phrases, key words, and start to see what's coming to the surface across all of the survey answers. And again, just see, like, what am I hearing from people? What am I learning? And then there are some technical ways in terms of how you can go about analyzing that, where you can attach numbers and codes to different key phrases so that you can actually end up analyzing qualitative data in a quantitative manner if you wanted to, and add it to your other quantitative answers. So just because it's like an open-ended question or somebody's opinion, it isn't a throwaway question at all. It's actually very helpful to building the narrative. And so I wouldn't shy away from those at all. I would definitely include those. And then it's just a matter of learning some of those tricks of how you can more readily analyze those. Okay. So again, we want to be sure that we're considering our audience. So we've talked about that a lot over the sessions that we've led, not just today, but previous ones as well. Really thinking about the community that you're serving, the community that you're wanting to learn information from, so that you can understand yourself and your organization better and your place in it. So that's really important. And then ask yourself, again, back to that purpose question, what do you really need to find out? So you don't want to ask questions that you already know the answers to. Again, that's just going to waste people's time, and it's just unnecessary. So you really want to get down to, in the questions, as succinctly as possible, what you really need to find out. And then what's the best way to uncover that information? And that runs the whole range of who's giving the survey? Is it in person? Is it going to be sent via email? Is it on the phone? Some of those options seem kind of old-fashioned, I guess, for surveys, but they're really not. They can be very productive. So you're not limited to just doing it online. So think about the best platform, and then think about the best way to ask those questions. We go back to thinking about bias and word choice. So think about those things as you're trying to really uncover that information and the best way to go about that. So I've talked a lot. I'm gonna let Scott fill in and just add to some of those things we talked about.
Yeah, and if you're okay with it, Monica, because we got a list of questions already in the chat, so we can kind of just start going through those, and then we'll bring Dave in at some point to talk about internal. But hit on a couple of these questions first. I'm going to take the easy one and give you the harder one of the first two. So I'm going to answer Leslie's question on letting different ways of collecting the data. That Sammy, Aaron, what would be an example of a question that does not allow for an authentic answer, and what would be wording? So start thinking about Monica.
Okay.
Leslie asked, is it okay to mix out there and getting answers by asking the questions and then recording the answers yourself? And the good news is there's actually research on this, and the answer is yes, it is okay. But, big but, if you're going to send people out to collect data, your data collectors to go through a training also, that they ask the questions the same way, no matter who it is. And we would call that, we want reliability, not just in the questions we ask, but how we ask the questions, right? So if you've ever been subject to a phone survey in election season, you know, there's just someone on the other end of the phone. Those people have been trained, ideally, to ask the questions the exact same way, not give additional information or indications of which way they favor something or not favor something. But there has been research that's shown that that you get the same, or at least very, very, very similar results. That being, no matter the method that you collect the data. That being said, whenever I'm doing it, Leslie, I actually create another variable that asks that basically records whether they filled it out online or whether someone answered in person. And I do that just to check my data anyway, to see if there was any bias in what type of people filled them out, right? So I might want to know that also. So it may not be a survey problem, it could just be an audience problem, right? So that certain audiences are more prone to answer one way and other audiences are prone to answer another way. All that being said, I will tell you there's old school researchers who don't believe it's survey research unless you're sitting in front of them with a paper and a pencil, collecting the responses yourself, but there has been a fair amount of research on this. Did you want to add anything to that, Monica?
No, I think yeah, I agree with all of that. And then Sammy's question, can you tell me what that was again about authentic? How do you make sure it's authentic?
Yeah, can you give an example of a question that does not allow for authentic answers, and what would be a better wording?
Oh, that does not allow. So typically, if you're asking a question that, again, that leading, it's similar to the leading example. If you're saying something along the lines of like, do you agree that this is true, yes or no? They can answer no, they certainly can answer no, but research shows that people are more likely to agree if you're saying, do you agree? They're taking the survey giver as the authority and the person who knows what they're talking about. And so it may be something that they're kind of like, I'm not sure, or they really actually kind of think this other thing, but this must be like the right answer. It's positioning it so that there is a right or wrong answer. And in a survey, it's not a test. It really is to gather information. So there isn't a right or wrong answer. So I think staying away from words that are, or phrases that are leading, where it is like, do you agree with this? I think that's probably the most straightforward example. But to really extract authentic answers. I think it goes into more like the types of feeling words that you use. So experiential words, things like that. So your experience, what is your feeling around this? And then what might be best suited is something where they can have an open-ended question option and fill in truly what their experience is. What that indicates to the recipient is that you care enough that you're going to read what their answer is, and you're providing them this opportunity to like explain it in their own words. So that's an option, but there are ways to go about that where you provide a list also. There's also the controversial other, and then you have like a list and you have other, and then you still offer an open-ended option. So you have to not just always make those choices, you have to make them with intention as to why you're really doing them, and really think through, how am I going to get the most honest answer from this person? If you read it aloud to yourself, or really even better, somebody who hasn't put the survey together, that's usually the best way to kind of pick those things apart and see them, because it's hard to see ourselves sometimes when we're doing those things, especially if you're doing it like under pressure or in a hurry. Surveys in a hurry are bad. Don't ever do that.
Monica, somebody just asked why other is controversial.
Oh, so other is just, so if you're offering a list of options, like offer a list of options, is a lot of people's thought process. If you want an open-ended question, offer an open-ended question, like make that decision. So that oftentimes is the argument, because if you do other, it's going to be kind of like at the end of this list of options, I didn't see what I wanted. Here's this like random thing that I'm going to put in there. I'm not opposed to them at all. I think that they have their place. I think it just kind of depends. If you are asking for something and you give a list, sometimes what that does is it helps like prompt people's minds of like, oh yeah, that could be an option, that could be an option. But that actually prompts them to put something different that you yourself, as the survey designer, didn't think to include. So I think you can argue it any way, but a lot of people say that you should make the definitive choice of like, this is going to be a 5-option list, closed question, or I want to go the qualitative route and have an open-ended question. Scott, I don't know if you have a preference on that.
No, I think it's a great point. I think the way you framed it is really good. Though, for a specific way to deal with that problem, if you're not going to provide another, provide a not applicable or unsure. Because again, it gets back to purpose. If I want to know how people feel about 4 choices, don't give a 5th choice. If I just want to know how people generally feel about like specifics in their life, make it open-ended. When I do use other, it's typically because I don't have a good feel for what people may be doing, and I don't want to provide a list of 30 possible options when I know most people are going to respond, 90% of the people are going to respond to 4 options, right? And so that's when the other would come in. Thank you all so much for your questions. We're going to keep this rolling, and I compare a couple of these a little bit together. I want to answer on the authentic thing real quick too. I think a good example is what we were talking about earlier about gender identification. If you only give male, female, there's no way to give an authentic answer to that. I found that a very specific example I'll give you too, and it relates culturally to different groups. I worked with a Vietnamese group once. Birthdays aren't a question you can ask. The group that I was working with didn't have recorded birthdays. So develop some cultural competence for the population you're serving, because you may put a question in front of them where they can't give you an authentic answer just because they don't know it, right? So that gets into it as well. That ties into a little bit of the JP's question around scale size. And I'll throw out my opinion, then I'll let Monica weigh in also. I generally like scales, the smaller the better, for a couple of reasons. And I'm not anti-big scales, but the inside baseball of this, so to speak, is that what you're trying to do with a scale is create variance in answers, right? And by that, what we want is we want people to be able to differentiate how they feel towards that question, like their response to that question. If I have too small of a scale, let's say 3, and the choices are don't like, not sure, like, I may not be able to get enough variation there, JP, to know that, you know, so someone's like can also be the same, could be the equivalent of someone else's unsure. Just because we're different people, what I say is a like, you could say is an unsure because I'm in between those two. So in that case, I may want 5 scales so I can get that differentiation. When my scale gets too big, let's say 10, then the responses may not mean anything. So I may respond 7 today to a question, and I may respond 8 or 9 tomorrow. So you don't want it to be so big that the differences don't mean anything between the different choices. The odd or the even is really a choice you have to make. I tend to, if I don't want to give someone a bailout of a midpoint, I make it an even scale. If I want them to tell me whether they're on the positive or the negative side of a given question, I'm going to make it an even because, again, purpose. If I don't care about that and the midpoint is meaningful to me, then I want to give an odd number of choices. The younger the group, the less choices should be made available. Their minds aren't big. Their minds can't. So if they're preteen, never more than 3 choices because they can't differentiate between multiple, like 5, 6, 7 choices. Hope that answers your question. Great. Monica, did you want to weigh in?
I mean, I agree with all of that. I just, the scale, the larger the scale too, people, like research in survey design has shown that people will like camp out in the like 6, 7, 8 range. Then like if people ask those same respondents how they feel about something, it's actually more definitive. But for some reason, when they're marking it down in a survey, they're like non-committal to go like all the way to the, you know, the far end of the scale or be right in the middle of like, no, it doesn't apply to me or the other direction. It feels like a safer zone to people. And so to me, that's not like an honest, genuine answer, most likely.
Yeah. Do you want to give a little more detail on bias and how people can test for bias? I do want to thank Misty for putting in the APA publication manual on bias-free language, but how do you, the question's essentially, how do you test for bias? What's the best way to go about doing that?
I mean, I think the best way to test for anything is to have a variety, like a handful of people, variety of perspectives, involved, not involved, take a look at what you are putting together, if that's available to you. As far as like testing the survey, it really has to be done in order for it to have been to test it. So you can't really test the language without the survey itself being conducted. And so if you want to do that before you send it out to the population that you're sending it to, then I would get like a pre-test group together to do that and be intentional about those recipients not being so involved. You'll get more critical feedback and more honest answers if you have people looking at it who weren't like the other person who was creating the survey, for example. It's nice to have the other person who created the survey check for like grammar and spelling and punctuation, but if you want to test for bias and language and context, then it's good to have people outside of your survey creation little world look at that and see. But there's all different kinds of things to think about in terms of bias. So there is language, obviously, and perspective. Again, there's that social expectation bias. And so it could be a phrasing and then the types of options that you give that you really want to be aware of in terms of, am I setting this person up to feel bad about how they're answering? So that's an important one too. You want people to feel safe and comfortable in your survey that they're not being judged so that they can answer honestly. So your wording needs to not sound authoritarian or judgmental. And that, I think the best way to test that is to read it aloud, have others read it as well.
Dave, we're gonna have more questions we need to get to, but Dave, did you want to, James asked early on about surveying internal versus external stakeholders. Do you want to give a commentary on that?
I'll offer a couple of quick observations, but it may be most useful to and try to model effective behavior in a way too. What is it that James is thinking about or meaning when he says internal versus external audiences? I candidly, because of the way I think about these things, I immediately thought about, well, internal versus external to the organization. I think, Scott, you were the one who pointed out earlier on one of the critical issues I see, which is, are you using language or assuming knowledge with a respondent group, people who are going to fill it out, that may or may not be there? One of my trite, but for me, useful rules of survey research is don't ask people questions to which they don't know the answer. You get crappy data, plus you irritate the respondent. So, that's where you mentioned jargon, I think, Scott, earlier, and that's the most common problem I see. But I really think it goes back to the theme that you two have been highlighting a lot, and frankly, employ some of the design thinking ideas. What's the experience going to be for the respondent completing the survey? And are they going to be able to make sense of it? Or, many of the points you guys have been raising and that our chat room discussions have been about is the misalignment between the person creating and processing the survey and the people who are completing it. Now, for that reason, I usually worry about using a survey in both internal and external the same survey in internal and external settings, because it's fairly rare. I mean, again, you got to go back to your purpose, but it's fairly rare that people are going to come from the same orientation and that you're looking for the same kinds of information and ability to assess it from internal and external audiences. So part of the issue for me is you mentioned demographics earlier, and you want those later in the survey, but you do want to know, for example, if you were using the same instrument for even various internal audiences. For example, we often work with organizations where we're surveying governing board members, executives, and if it's a large organization, managers and staff, sometimes volunteers as well. They're all internal, but they have a different frame of reference even there. And the jargon, by the way, Scott, I was seriously amused that your way of explaining don't use jargon because that's inside baseball. Sometimes metaphors become the internal jargon that you have to be careful of too.
Touché.
But I loved it. And Leslie, thank you for remembering my aversion to assuming best practices exist for things. Until you understand the context, yes, we need to be thinking about it. And by the way, context is part of that issue for the internal versus external. What's the frame of reference from which the respondents are going to be able to, or are naturally going to, respond to your survey? And the simplistic, easiest illustrations of those are the ones we've identified where you're like literally a different culture. But there's also organizational cultures that you may, in fact, be needing to survey for, but that's where you've got an issue of balance. And again, what is it you need to know? What is it that, how are they going to read the question? I feel it's so important to understand, well, to use the practice Monica was talking about, pilot testing, and the less like your audience you are, or the respondent pool that you are, the more you've got to do pilot testing. It's amazing. I mean, it may just be me, but the number of times I've written questions, and I was so thankful that I pilot tested it, because frankly, I knew I really only had one shot at an audience where I'd get their attention and they'd really spend time filling it out. And I thought, sure, the question was completely clear. And then to see how those dumb people, the others outside the organization responded to my intelligent, marvelous question, and they didn't read it the same way at all. So, but I would, I'm not sure that I'm responding to internal versus external as would be useful to James. So please do chime in with additional clarification, or if I missed the point, please raise that.
That's great. Let's keep rolling through some questions. We'll try and do these a little bit more rapid fire, unless we need to expound more. Monica, from Leslie, it's most likely we're getting a convenience sample. Can we still rely on the results from a purely statistical standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question to ask for sure. And I think that like any of the research that you're doing, I think you need to have some of that stuff called out and know it as you're analyzing it, as you're thinking about the responses and how you're going to use that information. Sometimes you don't have a choice. Sometimes like who you're able to send it to, that is what's available to you. And so some information is likely going to be better than no information. You still might learn something from it, but it's not obviously like the gold standard of how you would do research in terms of having things be random and a larger group and that sort of thing. But it can definitely still be reliable. You just have to know what you're dealing with and be really transparent with yourself and in your interpretation, and if you were to report that information of how you came to have that information.
Yeah, you just want to be careful generalizing from the data if it's not, you know, scientifically collected. Doesn't mean it's not valuable data. Alexandra asked, could we discuss surveys and culture? For example, worked in spaces previously where surveys were sent, but it felt more like checking a box rather than trying to gain insights from others. Yeah, no doubt this happens all the time. Right, I mean, you see it when you complete something and they ask you for your feedback and they give you maybe a couple of Likert scales and it feels like, you know, they just want, you know, they're checking an evaluation box on a session or something along those lines. One of the things that Monica talked about earlier that I would elevate again is from an ethics standpoint, people's time is valuable. If you're not planning on using data, don't ask them to give up their time to complete something, even if it's just for 2 minutes. There's an ethics to survey research or surveying period that you should always try to observe. And I think that also don't make surveys exceptionally long just for the sake of collecting data that you may want in the future, but you don't need now. Those are kind of no-nos in the ethics practice. Monica?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that describes what you want to be aware of for sure.
Yeah, from a culture perspective, you just have to, this gets into a different topic, but from a leadership, you know, you want to create a culture where criticism is valued, and that it doesn't mean you're going to get a negative performance review just because you got some critical feedback. Is there a tendency for people to want to give the survey giver the answers or information they assume they want? This kind of is the similar question, Monica, but did you want to weigh in on that at all?
Yeah, it's kind of a variety of that social expectation, that bias. Even if you've worded something in a way that you feel is not biased, there is a phenomenon of people wanting to answer things in the correct way. They see the survey giver as the authority, and they want to answer correctly. The best way that you can try to set yourself up to get more honest answers is truly just in that wording and being super intentional about how you've worded it, giving options. Back to Scott's point about the scale, that might be a good situation where you don't let people have like a neutral answer. You might force them into having like a positive or negative response to something. So really thinking about how you can help guide them towards more definitive answers, and hopefully that will uncover more honest answers as well.
Misha asked a great question about, you know, so a lot of times if you're doing survey research, you may go out and find a scale that's already been tested for validity and reliability, right? And then, but you still want to add maybe questions to it. Is that okay? And I'll throw out a couple of thoughts and then I'll let Monica weigh in. I actually did this for my dissertation. Monica, I found out, is the only person who's read that dissertation. But so the answer is yes, you can do it. And it gets into a deeper topic of scale validation and things along those lines. What the direct answer to your question, Misha, is that adding questions to an already constructed scale doesn't do anything to harm the scale that's already there, as long as you don't take questions away from that scale, right? If you subtract questions that were part of that scale, then you are potentially damaging that scale. Not potentially, you are damaging that scale. If you want to know if your new questions fit with the existing scale questions, there are techniques you can use to see if they have inter-item reliability, which is, I'm sorry, we're talking about jargon and things along those lines. Essentially, what it means is, do people respond to your new question the same way they respond to the existing scale questions, directionally? You've done this before if you've ever taken an SAT, an ACT, or a GRE test. Any standardized test, during the test taking process, you will complete a section that they tell you does not impact your results. And the reason that section is there is they are testing questions for future tests. And what they're actually doing is to see if you perform the same way on questions in the new section as you do to the questions in the old section. Right, that's what they're doing. They're putting in those questions to see if they respond, if people perform the same way. And if they do, then they'll use those new questions in the future. If they don't, they'll kick it out as a bad question. Monica?
Yeah, I mean, if anybody got excited about the things Scott was just talking about, there's like a whole career path on scale development, and it's all about like taking existing scales and adapting them and modifying them and seeing what works better, et cetera. And it's very much used in that standardized testing, and also in like IQ testing and personality testing. It's used in that a lot too. So it's called psychometrics, and it's a crazy, wonderful field, but that's what it's all about. But for the purposes of likely the types of surveys that community organizations are going to use, if you're using a scale that's already been used, and you want to add to it, that's fine. Oftentimes those scales are pretty rigorous. They're pretty in-depth with lots of questions. So what you need may not be so much. So I think it goes back to that question of what your purpose is and what you're trying to find out, and making sure that just because a scale exists, it may not be, and it may seem fancy, it may not be the right scale for what you need to find out. So, or it might be. So I think that it's worth looking at everything, but I think that it's important to know that you can get really good information with a really simple survey. So there's all of this crazy stuff that we've talked about, all of these points to think about. There are lots of areas that to dive into much deeper, and maybe we will if that's an interest for people, but you can also keep it really simple and get really great information if you're just being intentional about what you're doing.
Yeah, and I would just say that at the Midwest Center, we've done exactly what Misha was asking about with organizations that we've done evaluations for, where we agreed on a scale, we used a scale, but the scale didn't answer questions that didn't have organization-specific questions they wanted feedback on also in an evaluation. And so we added those also. It didn't impact the scale at all. We just were very clear when we were reporting out what was part of the scale and what wasn't. We didn't try and commingle those things. So that, I think we actually hit on every question that was asked. So normally we would move into breakouts, but there's only 4 minutes left. And one of the things we've been trying to do is get to as many questions as possible in these open sessions. So hopefully that was valuable. If it wasn't, Mark already put up, I believe, a feedback survey for you, consistent with what we're talking about. If you were particularly frustrated that we didn't get to the breakouts, let us know that. Our intention wasn't to exclude them. If we want to know, our intention wasn't to exclude the breakouts, but if we need to stop questions short and come back and do a video on them later and you want us to do it that way, we want to know those kind of things. So please do take a moment and fill out that survey so we can get better, as we always are trying to do. Are there any kind of outstanding questions or comments people have before we call it a morning? Yeah, Colette, any thoughts about surveys you can do to assess the need and define the problem you're trying to solve? Funders always ask. So I'm biased. Like, if I want people to define the need, I'm going to go qualitative. I don't want to put in their head what I think their need is. And the problem with quantitative is I've stratified what their responses can be. The only way you could do it quantitatively is through traditional kind of data points, right? On like poverty level, things along the, like using those kind of numbers to quantify the scale of the problem. But I like to start qualitative, allow them to kind of tell me what the need is, make some sense to it, and then use the quantitative numbers to give magnitude. Monica?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that if you start to define the problem before you're asking what the problem is by putting together a quantitative survey of some kind, what you think the problem is may not be how others see it. So I think that the qualitative approach, open-ended questions, interviews, that sort of thing, some combination thereof, is a better starting point, at least. The thing that a more quantitative thing, questions can get you, to Scott's point, is it can help supplement and support, especially for a funder. It can help build out that narrative of what's going on, so that you can say, here's what people are saying that the need is, and here are some data points to kind of help show that that is, in fact, what people are saying the need is.
Is that helpful, Colette? Good. Okay. Yeah. You don't think about it, but every time, once you give someone a question, you've impacted them somehow or another, and that's something to be particularly mindful of as you write questions. And that's what the bias conversation was about, and everything else Monica talked about. Great. Thank you guys so much. That was a quick hour from my perspective. Very, very quickly.
Maybe not to those listening. I don't know. Hopefully it was quick for everyone involved.
To James and Shara, it was quick. So, thank you all so much.